On behalf of the Cuba program, as well as the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, I want to welcome you all on behalf of the co-sponsors. Today, we have a particularly interesting topic, namely from digital governance to open government in Cuba. Our main speaker will be Harold Cardenas, whom I will introduce in a little bit, and our commentator will be Ariel Armony. And our right-hand person is Gretchen Sanchez. This webinar will be recorded, and it will be put up on the Cuba program website at the Institute of Latin American Studies website, as well as on YouTube, so that you can go back and listen to it, or if there's somebody who said they would like to have heard it, you can recommend that they check out either the Cuba program website or YouTube. The speakers will both be speaking on the record, but they will be speaking on behalf of themselves and not on behalf of the institutions where they work. In addition, after the presentation and the comment, there will be the opportunity for questions. If you wish to pose a question to either the speaker or the commentator, please put it in with your name and institution into the chat room. We are not going to be using the Q&A function this evening, only the chat room. So please put your questions in the chat room with your name and your institution. Our speaker tonight is Harold Cardenas, who is the director and co-founder of JOVEN CUBA, a blog focusing on contemporary Cuba. He holds a master's degree from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University and was previously a professor of philosophy at the University of Matanzas in Cuba. Harold Cardenas has also worked at the Council on Foreign Relations and as a research assistant at Columbia University. His focus in terms of his own research has been on the boundaries between political analyses and communications. On that topic, he has lectured in Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Cardenas was selected as an emerging leader by the Atlantic Dialogue a few years ago. Currently, he is a private sector consultant focused on Latin America political roots. Harold?
Thank you, Meg. Thanks for the kind introduction and greetings to all tonight. First, I would like to acknowledge the colleagues at Columbia University that joined me in 2018 and 2019, creating an open government toolkit for Fundación Corona and the Colombian civil society. That research that we did a couple of years ago is what I have used today, and I have tried to adapt that a little bit to the Cuban context. But we are pretty much piggybacking on the collective effort of my colleagues. So I would like to acknowledge that first. So let's start first with a few definitions. Let's talk about what is electronic, digital, and open government. And then we can talk about what we have in Cuba and what could be in Cuba. So if you give me a second, I'm going to share my screen. I hope you're seeing it.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let's go to the beginning. Definitions. This is not the most fun part, but it's necessary. There are three different paths that the Cuban government can follow on this. There is electronic government, there is digital government, and there is open government. These three paths may be intermingled with each other, but some are definitely more advanced and more sophisticated than others. The oldest of all them all is electronic government. Electronic government is defined as the electronic provision of governmental information and services 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. That is one of the oldest definitions of electronic government. This is what we have in Cuba right now, electronic government. And even then, it's very limited because the amount of information that is available is very scarce, and convincing government officials in Cuba on the public value of open data is and will be very difficult in a country that has a culture of institutional secrecy like Cuba. I will go deeper on this later, but this is what we have in Cuba right now, electronic government. A more sophisticated perspective can be found in the Digital Government Observatory at the University of Havana. This is the logo that they use. The Digital Government Observatory shapes their strategy around the digital agenda for Latin America and the Caribbean, ELAC 2022. And that is organized by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the ECLAC, or CEPAL, as we call it in Latin America. I will call it CEPAL, if you don't mind. This is the logo on the right that they use for ELAC. One of the areas of action of ELAC 2022 is digital government, and that's what they are using in the observatory that they have in the University of Havana. I think there are like 8 areas of action, and one of those is digital government, and that's how they are shaping this. Opposite to electronic government that is more about services, more about one-way interaction, more about the promotion of government image online. The observatory's perspective on digital government is broader and follows the CEPAL definition pretty much. So how do they see this digital government? It's an ecosystem made up of state actors, non-governmental organizations, companies, associations, and people in charge of the production of and access to data, services, and content through interactions with the government. I promise that I tried to get the simplest definitions that I could find. These are the shortest definitions I could find for this topic. So this is digital government. On the other hand, open government. This concept has been around for a number of years now, but really gained momentum in the past decade, especially since the launch of the Open Government Partnership in 2011. On the left, you will see the logo of the Open Government Partnership. They pretty much bring together governments and civil society leaders from around the world to work on open government. Open government then will be defined by a culture of governance that promotes the principles of transparency, integrity, accountability, stakeholder participation, all of this in support of democracy and inclusive growth. This is the OECD definition in 2019. And I know that this will sound idealistic, but I promise that this is not rainbows and bunnies in the heads of academics that are talking about this. There are many countries right now accomplishing democratic goals with this approach. In our work, for example, with the Colombian civil society and studying other models of open government in the world, we identify 3 pillars for open government. The first pillar is transparency. Pretty much it's a basic governance principle, being transparent, that encourages public institutions to promote accountability and encourages the use, reuse, and distribution of data. So that's the first pillar that we have for open government. The second pillar that we have is participation. Participation and collaboration. This is to promote citizen engagement and to develop an operating environment that enables participation in the civic sphere of the country. And the third pillar is the most difficult one, is the most advanced pillar that we have, is the one that the very few countries actually can achieve this, because it's a very ambitious goal. And it's pretty much a long-term and ongoing process where the government is seen as a collaborative platform that includes citizen participation in the policy-making process. Pretty much is where all actors are involved in the public policy. So the government is not so much the entity that does the policy, but the platform where citizens can do the policies. So this is the final part. the last pillar of open government. So we have these three. We have transparency, participation, and co-creation or collaboration. Sometimes other countries use the term collaboration for the other pillar. So our project, for example, we found that the pillars of open government are like gears that are turning into one another. This is the theory of change that we use, the methodology that we use when we were addressing this issue. The more transparency that we can achieve, the better participation and the better creation of public policies that we will find in the country. That is the reason why the initial process is so important. If you don't have political will, if you don't have access to information, if there is no trust, it's very difficult to achieve a healthy and democratic environment in a country. This is the theory of change that we use when we approach this in Latin America. What we're seeing now is a short timeline on open government and what Cuba has done on this. I would like to start in 2011. This is when the Open Government Partnership emerged. When this emerged without Cuba. These were 78 countries that founded the OGP. Cuba was not included. In 2018, in 2016, the Open Government Partnership launched a program for local territories. Even if national governments were not interested, because in some countries, like the government was not interested, but a municipality was, or a city was interested. So the Open Government Partnership created toolkits and created a model so that small territories could actually use this, even if the national government is not interested. So this is very helpful. So they created these territorial programs that will be very, very useful for Cuba. This is what the Open Government Partnership did in those years. But I would like to go to Cuba. In 2018, the Cuban government defined its social communication policy. That's how they call it. The social communication policy announced that electronic government was a modern solution for the country. The scope of this initiative and the scope of this electronic government was uncertain when we read about it in the beginning. I was among the skeptics of the Cuban state capability to actually have a comprehensive policy towards this. But actually there was a sincere effort to bring the national and local authorities online in Cuba. So for example, in April 2019, President Díaz-Canel announced that they accomplished the creation of public institutional portals in all agencies, like all institutions in the country had portals, and all territorial governments in Cuba had their own portal. So within a year, in only 1 year, 146 municipalities were brought online in only 1 year. That was a huge leap for Cuba that had nothing before that. In only 1 year, they actually did something that was very good. This was the first stage that they had planned in the government plan for electronic government. The second stage that they planned then will be to increase the people's interaction, and then that will be followed by online commerce. But in early 2020, COVID happened, as we all know. When Cuba was shut down, like the rest of the world, the educational system was unable to provide online classes. So education was pretty much stopped in the country. The online stores were crashing all the time. People were very mad and frustrated because they could not buy online in Cuba. Most of the Cuban economy just couldn't work with the social distancing rules. So the infrastructure to work online just wasn't there in Cuba, wasn't there yet. But there was political will to bring the government online, and that will to interact with citizens remain after 2020. I would like to address that beyond the obvious economic incentives of providing services online that every country and every government has, there are political considerations. There are political incentives for the Cuban government to bring the government officials online, to bring the institutions online there. Like other countries, Cubans use these platforms of online government not only as a source of information, but also for propaganda purposes, like many countries do that. One of the main differences between the Cuban strategy online and the other countries that we have studied is the lack of sophistication. That's what we have seen so far. Beyond the democratic benefit of these tools, most of the governments that use these tools use it in a very subtle way. If they want to display the achievements of the government and the vision of the government, they do it with a lot of subtlety. The Cuban government does it very bluntly, does it in a clearly propagandistic way, and that becomes ineffective in that manner. Like their own objectives are not achieved because of the manner that they conducted. So I know, on the other hand, also I know that some will argue that the Cuban authorities have more existential challenges than bringing the government online, like feeding its people is more important than putting internet in municipalities for the government. But President Diaz-Canel has made it clear that this is a top priority for the government, and it actually is. For democracy, for democratic health, you need the government online. There is zero accountability, and there are many countries that demand the Cuban government accountability and democratic advancements. Well, this is very important for that goal. So these are some things that I would like to add to this topic. I would like to go now deeper into what is the Cuban electronic government. What is the plan for the electronic government in Cuba? There are 5 stages right now. The first one is to achieve presence, to use technology to offer basic information to the public. So if you live in a municipality, you can open and you can read who is the head of the government, who are your representatives, how do they work. They have pretty much already done that. It's very shaky because many of these websites keep dropping and you cannot access many of those. But domestically in Cuba, most of them are online. The second phase that they have or stage is interaction. They want to offer services and establish contact via email with the citizens. The third one is transaction, carrying out complete procedures online, like so that you can register for operations. The fourth one is transformation. That is the total integration between agencies in Cuba, to have the private sector and the citizens offering more personalized services. So this will be more interesting than what we have right now. Cuba is definitely not in the transaction or the transformation stage at this point. They're not even there. And the fifth one is very interesting, is democratic participation, to use the electronic government tools to exercise citizen rights, for example, to vote electronically in Cuba. I would like to make a parenthesis on the fifth one, because we found that this last stage of democratic participation in some of the media coverage in Cuba was present. Like some articles, some media coverage was included in democratic participation. Other articles didn't mention that. If you go to the website of the Ministry of Communications right now, you will see that democratic participation is not included. They only show 4, even if the media coverage was mentioning 5. So probably the democratic participation stage still requires some convincing from government officials in Cuba. You have to get the buy-in from all of them to actually do it. But it was included in some of the coverage that we saw it. As you can see, the current plan that they have is mostly focused on providing services. There is not much room for collaboration. If you see, this is very focused on services and is in one way. There's not much room for collaboration, for collective participation of citizens in the decision-making process. And I would like to add that this is very weird for a self-described socialist country. The fact that this is so unidirectional and there is no feedback from the citizens for a self-described socialist country is super weird. I'm going to mention an example on this. Something so simple as participatory budgeting. That doesn't exist in Cuba. You can find participatory budgeting in Argentina, in Romania, in South Africa, even in New York. New York is the mecca of capitalism and has the largest participatory budgeting process in North America. So it is really incredible that Cuba, after 6 decades of socialist revolution, keeps the budgeting of the government in the hands of bureaucrats and doesn't allow the citizens to participate in that. And the more cynical among us will say that that is the nature of the Cuban government and is related to corruption. Probably there is some corruption in that, but I also think that there is a more simple explanation. Probably is mediocre management and lack of imagination, not giving the citizens the possibility to participate in the budgeting at the local level, at least. Now I would like to focus on the future of the government online in Cuba. So on December 17, 2020, and this is a very interesting date, the Digital Government Observatory emerged in the University of Havana. If you look at the date, it's exactly 6 years after the announcement of normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States. I'm not sure if this is a coincidence or not. Maybe it's a coincidence. On the other hand, this happened just over a month after the electoral victory of Donald Trump. By the way, this is Trump's only electoral victory. The observatory was created, and I'm going to quote the local media in Cuba, with the purpose of articulating institutions involved in this issue. This is the logo that they use for the observatory. They are focused on they focus not on electronic government like the actual government does. They focus on digital government, and there is a difference between both of those, as we have seen before. Its view is broader than the current national plan that is more electronic. The publications that the observatory does often contain explicit reference to open government. So this is very interesting. It would be good to ask which of these perspectives will prevail on time. You might be asking, so who is going to actually, what are we going to have in Cuba? An electric government or a digital government? And how does that work, having an observatory focusing on one and the government promising another one? According to Ernesto Rodriguez, that is the Deputy Minister of Communications, according to Ernesto Rodriguez, digital government is the electronic government's natural continuity. This is the Deputy Minister. So after electronic government, we should have a digital government in Cuba. This sounds very promising. If we review the work of the observatory, if you go online right now and you look at the digital observatory, Digital Government Observatory of Havana, you will find that first, the team is very young. You will find that the presence that they have online have many references to open government, have many references to the topics that we're talking about now. And this reveals a clear goal towards civic engagement and participation, even if it's not present in the official plan published in the Ministry of Communications. What the observatory is doing is far more advanced to what the current plan is for the government right now. So their capacity to actually implement this in Cuba will certainly be interesting to see in the coming years. I think this will be a great example of internal forces trying to modernize the state and to make the Cuban state more competitive. But surely, I'm sure that they will encounter resistance from the more conservative factions in the Communist Party and the government in Cuba. So it's interesting to see how this will develop in the future. The observatory also has reference to open state, not deep state, open state. Open state, and this will be the last definition that we'll use. Open state pretty much is the notion that open government influence all policies, public powers, and all levels of government. So you will have an open parliament, you will have open justice, you will have public powers, you will have open local governments, for example, working, and everyone will be contributing to have an open state. This is a much more ambitious goal, but it's good that they are actually talking about this in Cuba. This is a government institution where this discussion is happening. In any case, for the implementation of a modern digital government and hopefully a more open approach in the future, this is the context that we have today in Cuba. On the institutional side, a need to strengthen the institutions. Like the good thing is that they have strong enforcement mechanisms. The bad side is that they lack a legal framework for transparency and participation. There is a confidence crisis in public institutions in Cuba. On the other hand, capabilities, government capabilities also must be increased on the institutional side. There's a lot of there is a centralized political will. If the government wants something done, it gets done. And on the other hand, the potential coordination between national and local government means that if Havana wants something done in Santiago de Cuba, it gets done. It's not like other countries that the national government wants something done, and it's very difficult to implement that in provinces or in states, like in the United States. In Cuba, there is a centralized government that actually has the capability of implementing all of this very quickly if they want to. On the downside of this is that there is a lot of mistrust in the benefits and results of civic participation. Actually, government officials are skeptic, to use an euphemism, of civic participation. They are concerned about civic engagement. On the other hand, there is a lack of transparency and participation structures. Like there is no one in a municipality or in a province that actually handles participation and transparency. No one is in charge of that. That is one of the guidelines that they have, one among 12 different guidelines, but no one is in charge of actually implementing this in Cuba. On the cultural side, there is an emerging civic culture with an increase in civic engagement in Cuba. The downside of this is that there is a lot of political radicalization, and there are actually dynamics of hate among the political actors. There is a lot of the dehumanization of the other when you go to the political sides of Cuba. That is concerning, because if you want to actually have an open government or digital government that is sophisticated, you need civil society engaging among each other, and you need them working together. Not a polarized society is much harder to do this. But I don't have to explain a lot about polarization in the United States. Transparency and participation. There is an emerging network for civic participation. There is a lot of public pressure on services that must be delivered. But on the other hand, there is a lack of open data in Cuba. There is a lack of government accountability in Cuba. So these are some of the strengths and the weaknesses that we can find in the Cuban context right now. The following map covers 12 international cases that we studied when we were doing this research from specific countries and municipalities that are participating in open government. I think most of these or all of these participate with the Open Government Partnership at the national level. Some are local. You will see name of specific cities. I think that Cuba could evaluate the most successful experiences here and learn from them. But it's important to say that right now, requesting admission to the Open Government Partnership for Cuba will be very, very difficult. The Open Government Partnership has an eligibility criteria and a values assessment in place before accepting any new members. And right now, as for now, for example, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are considered non-eligible countries to join the organization for reasons that we can all imagine. So Cuba will not be able right now to join the OGP. That doesn't mean that they cannot learn from the experiences that they have. So they could potentially in the future pivot towards a more open approach, but definitely there are many lessons to take from here, and they're actually doing. It's a good thing that Cuba is not waiting to be accepted in the OGP or something like that to actually bring the government online. I would like to talk about some challenges to the collaborative possibilities of open government in Cuba and online government in general. If we had to mention challenges here, first, I would like to mention a lack of interest from most of the political actors in Cuba. There's a lack of interest from most of the political actors in embracing a diverse civil society and democratic participation. And I'm including the Cuban government here, and also like almost all the political actors in Cuba have it very hard recognizing the legitimacy of the other. So that is very concerning for civil society in the country in general. It's a fragmented civil society, what Cuba has right now. And that is a big challenge. On the other hand, there is a lack of technological infrastructure. This lack of infrastructure in Cuba has been worsened by increased United States sanctions. Like, I will say that in 2016, Cuba was in a much better place to achieve a modern infrastructure than it is today, even if they have invested a lot since then, because the Obama administration was willing to help to allow companies to invest in Cuba, to bring technology to Cuba, and actually to help the Cubans being online. After the last administration and with the current administration, there is a lack of interest from the US side to actually provide a technological infrastructure in Cuba in a normal manner. Another challenge will be an increased political polarization in the country. I think I mentioned this before. This has been fueled by both the Cuban and the US government. This political polarization undermines civic engagement in the country. The other thing is that there is a heightened political sensibility in anything that is related to electronic, digital, and open government in Cuba. Like, probably the government considers this as a national security issue. And I would like to mention for last, the weaponization of civil society and participation in Cuba for regime change purposes by the United States government. Like, if you use civil society as a tool for political goals, it loses its own nature. It loses, the normal dynamics that this has, and it puts the Cuban government in a defensive position against that. So these are some of the challenges that Cuba has right now on this topic. I already mentioned participatory budgeting, but I also would like to mention the following examples for good governance. These are common practices in open government that we could bring to Cuba. None of them are ideological. None of them are in nature capitalist or socialist per se. These are all universal principles of good governance that can be applied in any country. First, patrimonial declarations. That means requiring public administration officials to make a detailed report of their assets. Right now, Cubans don't have what assets the leaders have, and this is this is a topic that is discussed a lot and is very easily politicized. It will be very healthy to have patrimonial declarations in Cuba. On the other hand, public salaries, to facilitate the access to information on positions and salaries of all public officials. This will help, both of these two, of course, will help to avoid administrative and political corruption in Cuba. If you know what they have before they get into office and what they have when they leave the office, you know if they committed corruption or not. And if you know the salary that they got when they were during office, then you know if the money that they got and the assets that they have are not normal, a result of corruption. And on the last, policy tracker. I think a policy tracker will be very good. This will provide a registry on the policy decisions of public officials in Cuba. Right now, if a local representative in Cuba is voting against LGBT rights, the citizens don't know. The citizens don't have any way to know what are the specific positions that their leaders have in the local and the national level. I think it's twice a year that Cubans see the National Assembly on television, and it's like you get a couple of hours every year on television to see what the top representatives do and what they say there, but the actual policy making process is never visible. So if you have a tracker on this, if you actually have if you actually have a tracker that you can measure what are their positions, you can start voting for them, not based on the biography that they give you or the political correctness of the candidates, but on the policy record that they have, what positions they have on the issues that matter to me. So I think that will be very, very easy to do. This will be some healthy first steps, participatory budgeting, and these three. There is absolutely no reason to keep the citizens in the dark about the assets, the salaries, and the decisions that the officials make in Cuba. And I repeat, these are universal values that should be applied to any government. We could also have a discussion on the state of emergency in Cuba, on how COVID and the United States sanctions might complicate some of these policies and the implementation of this. But the fact that none of this or any other initiative like this is implemented in Cuba, that sends a very strong message of lack of political will on doing it. So I think the biggest stakeholder and the biggest actor on actually being interested to do this is the Cuban government. Before I finish, I would like to show you a success story, because I have talked a lot about open government and electronic government and digital government. I would like to show you the first open government initiative of Colombia. This is one of the best initiatives of open government in the world. It's a 90 seconds video. I think it will provide you a better idea of what we are talking about here. And after the video, I will return the microphone to Meg. By the way, the video is government propaganda, but it's good propaganda. It's also transparency, it's also participation, and it's also collaboration. So let's watch it quickly, and I'm going to give the microphone back to Meg.
Existen gobiernos que piensan en la gente, que son amigos de la ciudadanía. Gobiernos que entienden que combatir la corrupción y cuidar los recursos públicos permite el crecimiento y desarrollo de una región. Con la confianza en nuestra gente, el poder de las buenas ideas y la participación de todos, podremos sacar nuestro departamento adelante. Pero para esto debemos trabajar unidos. Necesitamos que el gobierno y la ciudadanía sean uno solo. Hagámoslo por un Nariño transparente y demostremos juntos por qué somos el corazón del mundo. Nariño es el primer gobierno abierto del país. Conoce, gana. Hemos construido las herramientas para hacerlo. Declaraciones juramentadas de todos los funcionarios directivos de la Gobernación de Nariño. Informes semanales. Reporte audiovisual de las actividades y gestiones realizadas por la administración gubernamental. Rendición de cuentas mes a mes de cada uno de los directivos. Busco hechos. Sistema de búsqueda sobre temas de interés en la gestión de las dependencias de este nuevo gobierno. Lo estamos haciendo. Herramienta que geolocaliza las actividades desarrolladas en el departamento de Nariño. Gana PAE, control de la alimentación escolar. Gana Control, toda la información del presupuesto y la contratación del gobierno a tu alcance. Plan de desarrollo departamental, reconocido como el mejor plan participativo e incluyente de Colombia. Gana Pienso, plataforma de participación ciudadana para argumentar y votar las distintas propuestas de la Gobernación de Nariño. Gana Datos, datos abiertos desde cada dependencia para hacer veeduría a la gestión del gobierno, llevar a cabo investigaciones o construir aplicaciones y servicios. Estas herramientas ya están cerca de ti. Conócelas, fiscaliza y participa. Visita gana.nariño.gov.co.
So this is it. Thank you so much. I'm going to give the microphone back to Meg. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Harold. We will now have a comment from Dr. Ariel Armony, who leads the University of Pittsburgh's global engagement as the Vice Provost for Global Affairs and also directs the University Center for International Studies. He also holds a faculty appointment in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, as well as the Department of Political Science. Armony's work has been published in leading journals in the United States, Argentina, his home country, Colombia, Mexico, and China. He has published 20 books. His study, The Dubious Link, Civil Engagement and Democratization, was a university bestseller. He has also co-authored with Alejandro Portes, The Global Edge, Miami in the 21st Century, as well as a new book to be published by Columbia University Press, Emerging Cities, Origin, Structure, and Significance. In addition, with Julia Strauss, he co-edited a book entitled From the Great Wall to the New World, China and Latin America in the 21st Century. Armony is a frequent commentator for US and international media, most recently on the topics of the changing role of China in Latin America, the globalization of cities, and innovation in international education. His research areas also include democratization, civil society, and human rights. Before arriving at the University of Pittsburgh, Armony led the University of Miami's Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas. He has been a Fulbright Scholar, a Rockefeller Foundation Scholar, and residential fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He received a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, where he, of course, is now employed. Ariel will comment not only on Harold's presentation, more generally on issues of democratization and civil society. And for our audience, if you have any questions, either on Harold's presentation or Ariel's comment, please put them in the chat box, not in the Q&A box. We will only be emptying out the chat box. And another reminder, this presentation, this webinar is being recorded. It is on the record, and the recording will be up on the CUBA program's website as well as YouTube in about 2 weeks. Ariel?
Thank you, Meg, for the invitation to participate in this seminar. It's a real pleasure. And thank you, Harold, for a very interesting, engaging presentation. I want to start by saying that this is it's a complex, a very, very complex topic that really needs innovative and new ways of looking at it, because of course that if we start by looking at this from the perspective of a liberal democracy, we are going to immediately be locked into a conversation that I don't think will take us far. So I want to start by saying that I find interesting your initial approach defining 3 types of government: electronic, digital, and open government, and providing the different definitions. And I want to work a little bit with that by rethinking this along a different kind of framework. One can argue that there are 3 reasons why governments around the world are keen and very interested in engaging in the use of IT and digital when it comes to governing and when it comes to participation. And this is something that is, of course, very tied to democracy, but goes beyond democracy and reflects global trends. These are 3 dimensions. The first one is a general trend that has been happening for some time of low trust in institutions. That is, trust in government has been in decline basically everywhere. So governments are interested in providing these kind of digital services because that speaks to something that you mentioned, Harold, which is transparency. But in addition to that, and I found that interesting in your presentation, the OECD definition of open government talked about accountability. And interestingly, when you highlighted three elements, you talked about transparency, participation, and co-creation, and you didn't highlight accountability, which is an absolutely central concept when it comes to trust in public institutions, trust in government. And interestingly, in the materials that you share with us from Cuba, they talk about, in fact, accountability, rendición de cuentas, in addition to transparency. So this is the first dimension, low trust in public institutions. The second one is another phenomenon that we see around the world, which is very low levels of interpersonal trust. Therefore, these kind of digital platforms, this digital approach, whether it's digital government, open government, is meant to increase and facilitate citizen participation, to make participation more inclusive. And this speaks about two concepts that you mentioned, participation and co-creation. The third dimension is a demand, again, across the world for governments that deliver services. When we look, for example, at democracies, and particularly democracies in Latin America, one of the most important explanations for low trust in public institutions is closely, deeply correlated with the fact that citizens are not satisfied with the governments that they have and the role of a government, of a democracy that delivers services. So more effective service delivery is a third reason why governments engage in digital. And this speaks to something that was in one of your definitions, particularly in the definition on digital government, which is the creation of an ecosystem that integrates state agencies, non-government agencies or non-government organizations, companies, citizens associations, that is an ecosystem that provides broad access to data and services and that facilitates the integration among agencies and provides more personalized services. So, in my perspective, this approach is perhaps more helpful to think about the case of Cuba. How does the Cuban government, a non-democratic government, addresses low trust in public institutions, low levels of interpersonal trust, and the demand for more effective service delivery? In that sense, the distinction between electronic, digital, and open becomes blurred. It's more difficult to essentially separate these three concepts because they are really intertwined. And the question is, how can these three dimensions be addressed with the limitations that we see in Cuba? So to conclude, I'm going to mention very briefly a case of a country, the city-state of Singapore, which is considered by Freedom House as a partly free nation. It's a parliamentary political system that has been dominated by the ruling People's Action Party, and a system where the electoral and legal framework allows for some political pluralism, but it constrains the growth of a credible opposition and limits freedoms of expression, of association, and assembly. This is, of course, a different system than that of Cuba. Well, Singapore is an interesting case because in the 2010s, essentially from 2011 to 2015, they implemented an e-government master plan that aimed to shift from a government to you approach to a government with you approach. That is exactly some of the aspects that you were talking about, Harold, an approach in which the delivery of e-government services was conceived under a vision for collaboration and high levels of co-creation and interaction between the government, the people, and the private sector. The result of this master plan was very, very good. It was pretty successful. The surveys indicated that citizens were highly satisfied with the quality of the government's e-services, that they would recommend others to engage in transaction with the government through e-services. And this led in turn to new experiences in terms of e-government. So this is an interesting, I think, case, because this is not a fully democracy or completely free system, according, for example, to Freedom House. So let me stop there and start, Harold, with a question. How do you see the intersection of these three dimensions that I talked about, the low trust in institutions, the low levels of interpersonal trust, and the strong demand for more effective service delivery, taking place in Cuba when it comes to the efforts of e-government? What are the kinds of next steps of opportunities that you see that could happen in the island?
Thank you, Ariel. Thank you for a very interesting presentation there. Effectively, Cuba has all of these that you have mentioned. I agree with you. There is a lack of trust in institutions. There is a lack of trust among each other, and there is a strong demand for service delivery. When we look at other countries in the region, even the services that the government provides are more effective than in Cuba. Like Cuba has a state of emergency in general in many other things. How do you build trust with the government, and how do you build trust among people? Well, I think it requires a strong commitment from the stakeholders that are involved in this process. It requires a democratic commitment from all the parties that actually influence civil society in Cuba, that influence the government behavior in Cuba. In my opinion, I think that, for example, the normalization process that Obama was doing was very healthy for this process of building trust in society. I saw a civil society that was flourishing in those years. I saw a government that was much less repressive than what it is right now. So sadly, the Trump policy and the Biden policy at this point have increased the lack of trust in institutions, have increased the clash among Cubans and the polarization of the society in a civil society that is with the government and a civil society that is against the government, and that is not helpful to building among everyone what they have to do. So it is very difficult because the political implications of the actors that have a say in what is happening in Cuba. I see a general lack of real democratic commitment from them. I think that the big players here are more interested in keeping the power or regime change, or very specific goals that are very political. And the people are not learning to be more civic. People are not learning to be more democratic in general. People are learning to hate the other persons. People are learning to not practice empathy among each other. So it is very hard to build trust in the institutions when the institutions fail you. it is very hard to build strong institutions when you are in the middle of a pandemic and when you are in the middle of an economic crisis. So I think that is very complicated, the Cuban scenario for building trust. And I actually, in my opinion, the Cuban government has come up with an electronic plan, a plan for electronic government and everything, and the University of Havana has a very good team of young communication specialists working on digital government. But in general, Cubans as a population, there has been a democratic backsliding in the last couple of years. People are less interested in democracy, are less interested in civil society, civic engagement normally, and are more interested in achieving specific political goals for their own gain. So that is very concerning. I think that is not very promising. We need a better commitment from the governments that have an influence in Cuban civil society, and we don't have that right now. One last thing. For me, it was very interesting to see that, for example, the Colombian government is not particularly the success story of Latin America in the democratic conversation, Colombia, but it's one of the best cases of open government in a specific province, because there was political will in that city, in that province, in the governor that province had, to actually open the government and embrace a democratic behavior with the citizens and among the government. So it all comes to political will. When you have authorities that are actually committed with this, they will do it well. What I will see, for example, even the Colombian example is very good. It was more open government. Very often will be more something to show that you are transparent than actually being transparent. So it's also used for political goals, and not really for implementing all these things that we are talking about. So politicians will talk about being transparent, but they don't want to show how much they're making. They don't want to show the patrimony that they have. So that is concerning. And in Cuba, you will have faced the same resistance. What is the reason that Cuba today doesn't have public access? Cubans don't know what their leaders vote for, or what specific policies they are supporting or not. And that is concerning.
So, Harold, if I may follow up with another question and quick comment, Harold, I would like to push this a little bit, and be a little, I'll be a little bit controversial. Is it possible when we think about e-government to separate many of the things that you were talking about, the demand for democracy, political rights, political participation, that is, those elements that define a particular political system, from the concrete delivery of services? Is it possible for government to build a good, effective e-government structure that addresses the delivery of services with a model that guarantees transparency, that guarantees accountability, that increases trust in public institutions? And I'm talking about a completely different set of issues. I have issues with electricity in my neighborhood, so e-government offers the possibility to immediately alert the proper agencies that we have issues. There is a possibility to, in real time, to see what is being done, what they are fixing, and if things are not being done, there is a system of accountability where I can use the e-government platform to put a complaint so that it is processed and my complaint is being addressed. That is, in sum, can we separate? Is it possible to separate these two dimensions when we think about e-government? Because many of the things that you were talking about are not going to be resolved by having a digital government, an e-government that is, you can publish the salaries of public officials in the printed newspaper. You don't need an e-government platform for that. So what I'm talking about is the use of a particular technology to improve the way in which government works. So is it possible to separate these two things, or you think that they are embedded, they are interconnected in such a way that it will be very, very difficult for the government to actually make operationalize to make real this idea of an effective e-government?
Thanks, Ariel. Okay, the delivery of services in Cuba there was a long discussion about that during COVID because Cubans were stuck at home. They really needed to buy food, for example, and they were super frustrated because the delivery was just not there. And they will lose money, the delivery never arrived. So this is a topic that was very hot just a year ago. I think the reasons for this are, for example, the lack of infrastructure in Cuba right now is a mix. There are mixed reasons for why there's so little infrastructure. Yes, there is the US embargo. It's true. It's hard to bring technology. Even when Google wanted to do something, you will have objections from both the American government and the Cuban government. So it's very hard to implement infrastructure in Cuba. On the other hand, we cannot forget that Cuba is arriving late to e-services because for a long time also existed a political concern with the internet in general. Like there were government officials that just didn't want the internet. Too risky, too open, to what the enemy will do with that. So those concerns prevented Cuba for a long time to actually getting into the internet, accessing internet in a massive scale. And that is also concerning. And I would like to make a quick comment on this too. I think that COVID caught the Cuban government in the worst possible position because of the delay that they had in implementing internet in Cuba. They got caught in the worst position they could be during COVID. They had not enough internet to work as a country. Like people couldn't work from home. That almost didn't exist in Cuba. People couldn't work from home because they didn't have the infrastructure to that. But people did have enough social media to actually organize the biggest political insurrection or uprising in Cuba in the last decade. So people did have enough internet to rise against the government, but not to work, not to have a normal life. If the Cuban government had actually achieved a better platform on time, they wouldn't have so many people frustrated online in social media and organizing with each other. So that got us in a very bad spot when COVID happened. There is also, on this matter of the services, there is also the issue of lack of trust in the private sector. For a long time, there has been a lack of trust in the private sector. These stores that people wanted to buy during COVID and they couldn't, they were government online stores. The private sector was not able to actually sell online and selling food and organizing themselves like that. It's very tightly controlled by the government, and it's a government that is not effective in providing these services. So unless they change their position with the private sector and they learn how to do public-private partnerships with the private sector, unless they learn how to collaborate with civil society in general, it's very hard that they can actually provide the services that the country has. even less right now. There is a strong trend of migration of professionals, and the computer science guy that might build a very good site right now, that guy is going to Mexico, that guy is going to Spain and coming to the United States. Is not staying in Cuba. It's a well-qualified professional that is not going to get paid $30 a month in Cuba. It's going to get paid a couple hundred or thousands in abroad. So those are some of the issues that actually shape why Cuba doesn't have an effective delivery of services.
Thank you so much, Harold. And so I will stop here my intervention, and Meg, if you want to pose some of the questions from the audience. Thank you, Harold. Really fascinating.
Yes, thank you both. As a matter of fact, we will now move to some of the questions in the chat room. If Harold and Ariel can both respond to them, not just Harold, if you have any thoughts. There's a question, would such a government be for the benefit of the, I have to scroll up, the benefit of the citizens, or would it be for a total control and surveillance of the citizens? Harold, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, sure. The notions of electronic government, digital government, open government require a strong government, require a government that that has normal capabilities and that can actually interact in a healthy way with the citizens. I think that some constraints are necessary, and I think that, for example, having transparency and having this level of communication with the people actually helps the accountability that Professor Armony was talking about, and that will help to contain some of the excesses that the government can have. And I think that would be helpful for the concerns of Jeff. But yeah, it requires a strong government. You cannot do any of these government policies if you don't have a strong government, like a normal shaped government working on this. On the other hand, I do think that we have to understand that we are coming from a participatory democracy to representative democracy, and this is totally different. This is a tool so that people, instead of leaving to their government official the decision-making process, people can decide by themselves. You know, this is a tool that the government creates so that people decide by themselves. So if anyone likes the idea of reducing the amount of control that the government has on you, they will love this, because this pretty much empowers people to do the decision-making process by themselves. The more interested you are in doing something, the more voice you will have, and your vote will count as much as any other person's vote. So it's pretty much taking the middleman out of the way and giving the power to the people. I know how this sounds, but it's actually giving the power to the people.
So what I would add is that I understand the reason why Jeff from the audience poses this question. It makes a lot of sense, but I would say that this is a dichotomy that probably it's an old way of looking at this. We are pretty much beyond this. That is, in cases like Cuba, and of course, you know, the best example is China, of course, very different scale, etc. Actually, e-government poses the challenge to work both to benefit the citizens while at the same time exercising surveillance and control. That is, I think that this is the, and I would say that in addition to that, the changing conditions, like Harold mentioned, the pandemic introduced other nuances into this complexity where a government, whether the government likes it or not, as we know, under COVID-19, needs internet services for many reasons, beginning with work and, of course, provision of health services, communication, et cetera. So that, I think, is the new reality where what we are seeing is that many governments are looking into the most effective ways to do both things, to provide benefits for citizens and to respond to that demand, which is very strong, and at the same time, unfortunately, exercise surveillance and control.
Gretchen, do you have any questions? Gretchen Sanchez.
Meg, I posted 2 questions. If Harold or Professor Armony want to answer one or both, I appreciate it.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Gretchen.
Oh, well, let's see. So I was thinking that this is my personal opinion. I think that there is a lot of quid pro quo going on in the Cuban government, and how can you control and how can you show transparency, and how can you actually tell what's the actual wealth of a government official coming into the position or actually getting out when there is so much going on? And I wanted to know, like, what's the right approach to control and to show transparency and contribute to open government?
Harold?
So, sorry, Gretchen, can you repeat the question?
Gretchen, can you repeat it? The question.
I'm gonna read it. In a Cuban government, what quid pro quo is practiced by immediate relatives of government officials as well as some officials themselves, how do you make sure that transparency is met to show the actual wealth of a government official?
Well, the transactional nature of government officials and their families is first of all, is not exclusive to Cuba. Like, I could mention members of the Trump family, of the Biden family, of almost many distinguished families in the US, that family members that benefit from the last name that they have. So it's not exclusive to Cuba. But in Cuba, the thing is that in Cuba, for example, I think that it goes under the radar very often. Like, it's very hard to know to what extent there is, to what extent they benefit from that. Transparency will definitely help to control this better. Today, there is no control under that. The only news that you receive about any possible corruption scandal or any possible, traffic of influence or something like that is on independent media. Independent media in Cuba is very politicized. Very often is also very propagandistic. Like, it has a political agenda more than a journalistic commitment. So we need actual tools that we can restrain the way that the government behaves, and that we can restrain government officials. But in Cuba, this is super difficult. Cuba has a tradition of authoritarian behavior that transcends the Communist Party. Before the Communist Party, you will have authoritarians in the right. You will have authoritarians that were conservative, some of were liberals, some of them. So there is a strong tradition of authoritarian behavior in Cuba that won't disappear after the Communist Party. It will remain there. If you look at the behavior of many of the political actors in the Cuban landscape, you will identify authoritarian behaviors in most of them. and the democratic behavior that we need is very much absent. So I am more concerned of creating guardrails for democracy, for creating guardrails for how a government must behave or should behave. I am more concerned on that than on putting this guy or the other guy or this political force or the other political force in power, because I think that the problems with traffic of influence, the problems with authoritarian behavior is not exclusive to the current government in Cuba. It's a national problem. It's a genetic problem that we have, and that we have never actually engaged with that issue. We have never actually had a conversation of how we as Cubans are going to face the authoritarian trend that we always had, and how are we going to stop people from taking advantage from that? How are we going to stop leaders from channeling the people's concerns and using populism and things like that to get in power? So I think that the guardrails, democratic guardrails, is what we need. And I think that will help with any government that we have. This, the next one, or the other one, that will help with any government. But of course, it's very difficult to create the guardrails if you don't have the government, if you don't have the political will in Cuba. So yeah, at this point, we are talking pretty much about aspirational goals, not about things that we can do right now.
Ariel, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't have anything to add to that. But if I may, I would
Please.
like to follow up with a quick question, Harold, that I think we need to address. And I want to go back to the digital, and I want to, focus on this topic for this session. Do you think that the emphasis or the desire of the government to advance on e-government may introduce even more inequalities in Cuba, in addition to the existing ones, because of differential access to internet and digital services? And drawing a little bit in some way from the other question from Gretchen, also in terms of digital literacy, where I imagine that there are really important differences across the different sectors of the population.
Thanks, Professor Armony. That's an excellent question. That is something that I have wondered myself very often. The access to information in Cuba is not equal. Like, I think you will see gaps that are, first of all, generational. Like, younger generations have way more access to information, so they will potentially be more informed on how the government performs. If this actually starts to happen, younger generations will know more than their parents or grandparents. On the other hand, there are racial implications, I think, because we have seen there is income inequality in Cuba, racially speaking. And the same way that we saw the white Cubans benefiting better from the normalization of relations with the United States because they had more money to invest when that moment arrived, you will have the white Cubans from urban areas like Vedado in Havana or Miramar, or like the jet set, the economic jet set of the country, that will definitely benefit more from this access to information. And there is something that we haven't seen yet, and is who is gonna benefit from the access to open data in Cuba. There is no open data in Cuba, but when you start having that, who's gonna benefit from that? Which are gonna be the small enterprises and which are gonna be the entrepreneurs that will use the power of open data, that is something super important here in the US, for example, and the rest of the world. Who is gonna harvest that power and is gonna use it in an economic way, or is gonna use it even for political reasons? Like when you have access to data and you can use that and you can measure how people behave, you can use that for political goals too. So who is gonna use that? There is a gap between, there is an age gap, there is a racial gap here, and there's also a geographical gap. Like the people in urban areas will benefit much more from this too than the people in rural zones. So yeah, that's a great concern to bring to the conversation.
Ariel, do you have anything else?
No, I would I think it's fascinating, and I am not familiar with the current studies that approach this issue, but it would be very interesting to learn more and to study these new types of inequalities that you mentioned when it comes to digital access and how these impacts sort of plans for enhancing e-government, and of course the implications in terms of various types of citizen participation. It's fascinating, and of course a completely new topic of, you know, these last few decades, something that did not exist before as a major topic. And so it introduces a very interesting new dimension to understand the Cuban situation and the Cuban environment.
Gretchen, you had a second question. No?
Okay. I think it was answered. Thank you.
Okay. Then I don't see any questions in the chat room. I'm going to ask a final question. And when we're talking about communications, when we're talking about digital access, etc., and the issues, the impediments to building cooperation, to building trust, there's an issue of how does one build trust in a situation such as Cuba in terms of media. You have a tremendous expansion of access to electronic sources of information, both government and non-governmental, over the past few years. The simple number of cell phones and people using the internet, people communicating via their cell phones and other mechanisms, so that one can presume that the distribution of information within Cuba is substantially greater than it was even 10 years ago. That type of expansion of media sources, electronic and otherwise, means that you can have certain positive elements in terms of building cooperation, collaboration, etc. You could even argue that some of the movements that have appeared in Cuba in, say, the last 3 years have been the result of that tremendous expansion of media within Cuba. Traditionally, the notion is that if you have that type of expansion of media, you have opportunities to build collaboration, cooperation within civil society. You also have what you've already addressed, and that is increase lack of confidence, trust, not only in government, but also in terms of your individuals within the society that you may feel more competitive with given the increasing inequalities. So with increasing digitalization, with increasing access to the internet and other sources of information, is that going to build more cooperation and trust, or is that going to exacerbate the lack of trust and the lack of cooperation within society in Cuba?
Thanks, Mac. I think that's a great question. I think that more doesn't necessarily mean better. The Cuban case is very particular when we talk about trust in the media. what media we're talking about. We're talking about social media that was supposed to bring us together, that was supposed to actually open Cubans to the world, and we ended up being radicalized politically. Like Cubans have ended up going far one side and far the other side, and just plainly hating each other. So, and also Cuba doesn't have the nuanced conversation that we have in the United States about the dangers of social media. Cubans are still too fascinated with the possibility of having Facebook. So we're gonna get, we are already, Cubans are already being struck by the dangers of social media, and there's not even a conversation in Cuba about it. So it's not going well how social media is working. And at the same time, yes, it's amazing that people have a voice in social media, and it's everything in the same package. But not necessarily meant that Cuba will be more democratic, or Cuba will be, you know, like Cubans could express their opinions. Yeah, but what are those opinions? Are those opinions shaping for better or for worse? If we're talking about traditional media, on the other hand, you know what Cuba could do? Cuba could not isolate the best. I'm going to give you the most recent example. In the past few weeks, there has been a very interesting debate in Cuba because the most popular media magazine in the country the Communist Party expelled the leader, the director of a popular magazine in Cuba. And there was a strong debate about it, and all journalists were expressing each other sympathy with this directive from a magazine, because it was the best example of young people trying to embrace a critical perspective on their reality within the institutions, within the government media, and political actors pretty much expelling them because of that. So there was a big conversation about it. So there is an oversight from the Communist Party and the communist youth on everything that is happening on traditional media in Cuba, that at this point, what has happened with this is that it's not credible. And what we have right now is a traditional media in Cuba that is not credible, and they know it, but they're not interested in changing it because they are more concerned of being open to criticism than being open to a more credible media. And these are not the years of Raul Castro embracing criticism and telling that people should change mentality. These are the years of cracking down on criticism. So sadly, this is what we have. This is the dynamic that we have right now in Cuba. So the possibility of building trust with such behavior in the media, if you don't want to make it really credible, there's not much success in building trust there. So either in social media or in traditional media, you have a lot of issues to solve. The political will is limited. And yeah, in general, some of these issues are not only in Cuba, like are not specifically exclusive to Cuba, but definitely Cuba is in a worse position to talk about this.
Okay, I think we have begun a really fascinating conversation that needs to be continued. And I hope that it will be continued. I think the dialogue between Harold and Ariel was very rich, and I'm very pleased that we heard some other voices too, Jeff and Gretchen, etc. On behalf of the Cuba program and the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, I want to thank our audience for joining us this evening. And I look forward to seeing ongoing discussions as rich as this one. So thank you all for coming. As I mentioned earlier, the webinar is being recorded, and in about 2 weeks, it will go up on the Cuba program website, as well as on YouTube. So you can listen to it all over again, or you can recommend it to your friends. Thank you very much, and good night. And thank you in particular to Harold, Cardenas, Ariel Armony, and Gretchen Sanchez. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you, Meg.
Bye-bye.